Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories.
Everyone thought Rachel had it all. To the outside world, her life was a polished portrait of success. Married to Adam, a man both dependable and kind, living in a home filled with soft light, fresh linens, and carefully chosen silence. But behind the calm exterior was a growing ache, a hollowness she couldn't name. Each morning she woke up next to a man who still kissed her forehead but no longer reached for her soul. Conversations had become functional, like grocery lists spoken over dinner. There were no fights, no explosions, only the quiet erosion of connection, like water slowly wearing down stone. She smiled in photos. She performed gratitude. But deep down, Rachel felt like a ghost in her own life, wandering a house that looked like hers, but no longer felt like home. She began to wonder if love meant anything without intimacy, or if security had become a prison with a velvet lining. It wasn't that anything was wrong, and that was the problem, because sometimes, the most unbearable sadness comes not from chaos, but from the suffocating peace of a life too quiet. And in that silence, Rachel's restlessness began to whisper louder than she ever expected. It happened on a windless afternoon, one of those deceptively ordinary days that sneak up on you with quiet significance. Rachel met Megan at their old cafe, the one with crooked chairs and cinnamon-sweet air, where their laughter had once echoed like chimes in youth. Megan, still wild-eyed and free-spirited, looked like a woman who had lived 100 lives since high school. As they caught up between sips of coffee, Megan leaned in, eyes sharp with mischief and meaning, and said, "You've built a beautiful life, Rach. But do you ever feel like you're just surviving it?" The question hit like a stone dropped into still water, small, but unstoppable in its ripples. Rachel laughed it off at first, brushing the moment aside, but the words clung to her skin like perfume. That night, as she lay beside Adam, his back turned, his breathing slow and even, Megan's voice echoed in her head louder than the silence in the room. Was she just surviving? That question became a hum behind every routine. Brushing her teeth, answering emails, folding laundry. Megan hadn't meant to be cruel. She was simply a mirror, held up at the exact moment Rachel had stopped looking at herself. It was the spark that shouldn't have mattered. A passing comment, a friend's casual truth, but it cracked open something dormant. Not anger, not sadness, just an ache, a whisper of a different life, a flicker of longing, the first faint tremor before the ground begins to shift. It was late, the kind of quiet hour, where even the hum of the refrigerator feels intrusive. Rachel was alone in the kitchen, her tea cooling on the counter, when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, until she saw the name, Nathan. Her breath caught. Nathan! It had been nearly a decade since they'd worked together in that cramped marketing office with bad lighting and better memories. She opened the message. "Hey stranger. Just saw something that reminded me of you. Hope you're doing well." It was simple, harmless, but something in her chest stirred. A flicker of warmth, or maybe just recognition. She replied. Cautiously at first, politely, but like leaves caught in a sudden breeze, the conversation took flight quickly. Memories spilled out. Office pranks, long lunches, and late-night project sprints. He told her about his divorce with a rawness that startled her. And in return, she found herself confiding things she hadn't said out loud in years. With Nathan, the words came easily, like water breaking through a dam. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was attention, intimacy. A door cracked open to a version of herself she'd forgotten, a version that used to laugh without caution, that felt seen without having to explain. Nathan wasn't just a person from her past. He was a mirror to the parts of Rachel that had gone dormant. And in replying to that single text, she had unknowingly answered something deeper, a question her soul had been quietly asking. First, Rachel told herself it was nothing, just a few harmless messages, a friendly catch-up. She didn't delete the conversations, but she never mentioned them to Adam either. And that silence, that small omission, felt strangely thrilling, like slipping a note into a drawer and locking it shut. The more she spoke with Nathan, the more she found herself waiting for the buzz of her phone, for the flash of his name on her screen. It became her little secret, wrapped in digital thread and buried between laundry cycles and dinner prep. There was a rush in the secrecy, in knowing there was a world tucked away where she wasn't just someone's wife or someone's employee. She was Rachel. Unfiltered. Unapologetically seen. Nathan remembered things Adam had forgotten. Her fear of thunderstorms, her love for handwritten letters, her once dream of starting a bakery by the sea. These weren't confessions, not really. But they weren't nothing either. It was the emotional intimacy, the laughter and late-night texts, the soft compliments Nathan slipped in so casually. And Rachel, who had always believed she was too grounded to stray, found herself swept up in the weightless feeling of being wanted. She hadn't crossed a line yet, not in the way people speak of affairs. But in her heart, she knew something had shifted. Because secrets don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper. And the softest ones, the ones that live in silences, in sideways glances, in unread messages, they're the most dangerous of all. The more Rachel spoke with Nathan, the more she realized just how starved she had become. Not for love exactly, but for presence. For someone to ask how she was and wait for the real answer. With Adam, life had become a series of gentle nods and autopilot conversations. They functioned well as a team: grocery list, mortgage payments, car maintenance. But the spark that once lit their late-night talks had dimmed to a quiet flicker. Nathan, on the other hand, spoke to her like she was still someone becoming, not someone who had already been defined. He asked about her dreams, not just her schedule. He noticed when her tone changed. He remembered the sound of her laugh, and the way her voice curled when she was excited. It wasn't just attention, it was emotional alchemy. And Rachel, who had spent years convincing herself that contentment was enough, felt something inside her stir like a sleeping ember catching flame. She wasn't looking for romance. She wasn't chasing escape. But Nathan had unknowingly cracked open a part of her that had gone untouched, her longing to be seen not as a wife or a role, but as a woman. A breathing, aching, restless woman. And that hunger, the ache for depth, for recognition, wasn't something she could confess over dinner or solve with a kiss on the cheek. It lived in the quiet corners of her day, whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was still more to feel, more to want, more to be. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over a familiar landscape, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Rachel began to see her marriage not through her own eyes, but through the reflection Nathan held up to her. Each warm, attentive message from him illuminated how cold the spaces between her and Adam had become. Once she would have brushed it off. This is what marriage becomes, she'd say, a comfortable rhythm. But now, even the comfort felt like a kind of sleepwalking. She started noticing the pauses in their conversations. How often Adam reached for the remote instead of her hand. How silence over dinner had become a norm rather than a warning sign. They were not fighting, but that somehow felt worse. There was nothing dramatic to fix, no wounds to bandage. Just a slow erosion, like waves quietly stealing grains of sand. And in those moments Rachel saw herself clearly, how she had stopped trying, stopped asking, stopped hoping for more. Nathan wasn't the cause, he was the contrast. A reminder of what passion, attention, and real presence could feel like. And with that clarity came fear. Not of Adam. Not even of being caught, but of herself. The woman staring back at her in the mirror wasn't broken. Just buried. And now that the surface had cracked, she couldn't unsee the truth. Love without connection is a house without windows. You might still live there. But you forget what the sunlight feels like until someone opens a door. It was supposed to be just lunch, harmless, ordinary. Rachel had told herself that a dozen times as she stood in front of her closet that morning, debating between indifference and effort. She chose the soft blue sweater Nathan once said made her eyes look brighter, though she never admitted that was the reason. They met at a quiet cafe tucked beside the park. And from the moment she saw him, something unspoken passed between them. The hug lingered. Their smiles lingered longer. Conversation flowed effortlessly, like two people who'd never lost touch. But it was after lunch, as they walked through the park, that the shift occurred. Not in action but in energy. The sun flickered through the trees. The lake shimmered like a secret. And Rachel felt time slow. They sat on a bench, too close, too familiar, their knees almost touching. And then came the silence. Not awkward but loaded. Nathan looked at her the way Adam hadn't in years. Not with obligation, but with curiosity. With want. He didn't kiss her. He didn't have to. The moment pulsed with the kind of tension that lives in restraint. Rachel's breath caught. Her mind screamed boundaries, but her body memorized every detail. The way he leaned in. The way her skin buzzed in response. When she finally pulled back, it was only inches. But emotionally, she had crossed a canyon. No one saw it. No words were spoken. But a line had been drawn, and she had stepped right over it without ever being touched. Rachel hadn't planned to lead a double life. It simply unfolded, one quiet compromise at a time. By day, she moved through her world as she always had. Cooking dinner beside Adam, answering work emails, folding laundry with the TV humming in the background. But underneath the surface, another version of her was stirring. One who waited for Nathan's messages like sips of oxygen. One who lit up at the ping of a notification. Who smiled in secret at compliments she never dared to admit out loud. The contrast was dizzying. With Adam, everything felt muted, safe, routine, familiar. With Nathan, it was like stepping into color after years of grayscale. He asked about her day with a sincerity that made her want to tell the truth. He remembered things she'd forgotten she once loved, old songs. Art, the way she used to talk about traveling. Rachel wasn't blind to the danger. She knew she was drifting, one text, one shared memory, one heartbeat at a time. But it felt good to be wanted. Not needed. Wanted. And that desire, however unspoken, wrapped itself around her like a second skin. She started guarding her phone, curating her words, laughing a little too easily at the dinner table to keep suspicion at bay. But even laughter felt different now. Forced. Fragile. She was living two lives, one in plain sight and one in shadows. And with every secret smile, every late-night message, the space between those two selves grew wider and harder to reconcile. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable by all outward measures. The sun slid lazily through the kitchen blinds, the kettle hissed on the stove, and Rachel moved through her routine like a woman on autopilot. But something felt off. Not loud, not sharp. Just off. When she passed by the hallway mirror on her way to grab her coat, she stopped. For no reason. Or maybe for every reason. She stared. Not at her clothes or hair, but at her eyes. There was something unfamiliar in them. A shadow, a question, a flicker of someone she didn't recognize. Rachel leaned in, searching. And that's when it hit her. The woman looking back wasn't the version of herself she thought she still was. She wasn't grounded or steady or safe. She was restless, splintered, hiding. And for what? For a thrill she couldn't explain? For a man she hadn't seen in years, who suddenly made her heart race like she was 22 again? Guilt wrapped around her like a shawl, itching, stifling. Impossible to shake. She had become the kind of woman she once silently judged. The one with secrets. The one who smiled through dinners while texting someone else under the table. The truth clawed at her chest. She had crossed more than a line. She had crossed herself. Rachel turned away from the mirror that morning, but the image followed her. Because the worst kind of betrayal isn't against someone you love. It's waking up one day and realizing you've betrayed the woman you used to be. She had rehearsed the words 100 times, each version more careful than the last. But when Adam walked through the door, suitcase in hand and eyes heavy with the fatigue of travel, every script Rachel had written in her head vanished. His smile was soft, familiar, warm in the way only a husband's could be, and it broke her. Because she knew what that smile was built on, trust. And she was about to set fire to it. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice quieter than she expected, but quivering with weight. Adam froze. Not fully, just enough. Enough to feel the floor begin to shift beneath both of them. She told him about Nathan. Not everything, not every message, not every spark that lit her chest in secret, but enough. Enough to change the air in the room. Adam didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just stood there, as though the oxygen had been pulled from the space between them. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked finally, and that question gutted her more than any anger could. Because the answer was simple and devastating. She hadn't known how. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to reach for him. And now, as she looked into eyes clouded with betrayal, she saw what she feared most, not rage but sadness. A quiet, unbearable ache. She hadn't lost him in a single moment. She'd let go in pieces. And now they were both staring at the wreckage. After the confession, life didn't explode, it deflated. The house, once humming with quiet routine, now echoed with absence. Adam moved through rooms like a man trying not to disturb the ghosts. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice. He simply became smaller. Conversations, once automatic, dissolved into nods and silences. And Rachel? She tried to be present. She made his coffee just the way he liked it, folded his shirts with more care than ever. But every act of love now felt like a wound dressing a deeper cut. Nathan, the man who once felt like fire, had become a shadow, fading into the periphery just as quickly as he'd appeared. His texts slowed, the magic dimmed, and Rachel began to see it for what it was. A mirror, not a solution. She wasn't grieving the loss of Nathan. She was mourning the parts of herself she had betrayed in trying to feel something. This was the aftermath no one warned her about. Not the scandal, not the confrontation, but the quiet. The awkward breakfast where no one speaks. The ache in Adam's shoulders when he turns away in bed. The questions that hang in the air. Unsaid but heavy. Can love survive this? Can trust be rebuilt on fractured ground? Rachel didn't know. What she did know was that rebuilding would take more than apologies. It would take honesty, presence, and the terrifying courage to sit in the pain without running from it. And for the first time, she wasn't running. She was listening. There's a lie people tell themselves, that once the truth is out, everything will somehow make sense, that the dust will settle, and clarity will come like morning light after a storm. But for Rachel, the truth didn't bring clarity. It brought questions that refused to be answered. She sat across from Adam night after night. The space between them, once filled with comfort, now crowded with tension and things unsaid. Therapy appointments were made. Promises were whispered. But healing isn't linear, and forgiveness doesn't follow a schedule. Sometimes Adam looked at her with a flicker of the man he used to be, soft, open, trying. Other times his eyes were distant, unreachable. And Rachel, she oscillated between guilt and a strange, unfamiliar strength. Because while she wished she could undo the damage, she didn't wish away the awakening. Nathan had exited her life as quietly as he re-entered, his role complete. He was never meant to stay. He was the match that lit a truth Rachel had spent years burying. She had disappeared into the roles of wife, worker, caretaker, until there was nothing left of the woman who used to dream. Now, she stood in the rubble of her choices, unsure if her marriage would survive, but finally certain of one thing: she wouldn't vanish again. Not for anyone. Not even for love. Sometimes, when the dust doesn't settle, it's because you're meant to rebuild from the ground up. Not the life you had, but the life that finally feels like your own. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to fall into autopilot, going through the motions of relationships, careers, and routines without ever checking in with ourselves. But emotional neglect, even when unspoken, leaves deep cracks. The lesson in Rachel's story is simple but urgent. Don't wait until you're lost to start looking inward. Nurture your connection with your partner, but also with yourself. Speak honestly, listen deeply, and don't ignore the quiet pull of your unmet needs. Affairs don't start with betrayal. They begin with silence. So if something feels missing, don't run. Communicate before the distance becomes irreversible.